A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes, as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. That would be through chapter 50 of Brandon Sanderson's The Hero of Ages.
Hey there, this is Cross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
Welcome to Dry July.
Yeah, so taking a month off.
Yep. All of our recordings in the month of July, we have decided to go non-alcoholic because, I don't know, figured it'd be a fun experiment. I'd like to lose some weight and be a little bit healthier, so I've got my gym membership. I've been going to the Y. Went on a 20-mile bike ride yesterday. Not drinking today. Gonna be good. Gonna be good for me, I think.
I think it'll be a fun turn. I think really the idea here is to reinforce some good habits that we were getting into and just to remove any hindrances that could possibly be here for a month. I think is a good thing. And, we'd even considered doing this back in, I think February we were going to do a dry month, or March, but a combination of we had a bunch of guests on for short pours and we had a ton of kind of stuff culminating. And so we didn't want to short change anything that we were doing that way. But this is kind of a month to ourselves. So it felt right to, take the month and do what we will with it. So we appreciate you all following along. Our goal is to bring mocktails and some other drinks to light here. Before we start talking about our pathetic representation, today is our 7th episode discussing The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, and we are going to chat about chapters 44 through 50. But before we do that, PJ, as we're not drinking, what are you having today? I mean, I guess you are drinking it, but I'm eating a sandwich. I have some almonds. I'm just kidding.
I made a latte, so I have that sort of stovetop espresso maker thing. Yeah. Yep, exactly. Made some espresso and then just heated up some milk and frothed it to the point where I had half milk and half foam. Poured that shit together and then drank it before we actually started recording. So my back half beer, as it were, is Culture Pop. It's a probiotic soda. It's much more of a lightly flavored seltzer than anything. It's, 40 calories for the whole can. It's orange, mango, chili, lime flavored. Yeah, it's tasty. I liken it to those Spindrifts, which I think is something that you have right now. So, Crossley, what are you drinking?
So for those of you who don't know, I worked for a coffee company for about a year. And so I became quite a coffee snob. I was already kind of a coffee snob. It's a problem. And so I make pour over every single morning. So I am having some Counterculture coffee, the Apollo blend, which is a light blend. If you don't like light coffees, you're wrong. And I'll tell you why. So light blends actually have more caffeine than dark roasts. That is because they don't sit as long and they don't roast as long. And so part of the roasting process cracks the bean and that leaks the oils. Oils are what contain a majority of the caffeine that you get from coffee. So the longer you roast, the less oils there are inside the coffee. So if you ever pick up a bean, you can see a crack generally. If you see 2 cracks, a double crack, that would normally be filtered out of most of these sort of higher end coffees or these third wave coffee companies. I'm going to shut up about this. I've clearly been caffeinated now by the coffee that I'm drinking, but it's really great. It's really great. But you got to extract it right. Light roasts are bad if you don't do anything right with it. You have to actually treat it properly, which includes rinsing and, it's a whole process. But it's my morning ritual. So here we are recording this in the morning and I'm doing that. My back half beer, as it were, is a Grapefruit Spindrift, which is my favorite. Spindrift in general is my favorite of the seltzer brands because it's mostly just sparkling water plus a little bit of fruit. It's very simple. It's not meant to be anything else. They don't add any additives, nothing secretive. They're almost always 0 calories with a couple of exceptions, such as the grapefruit, which is 17 calories because they have to add a decent amount of grapefruit juice, and they do add a little bit of orange juice to it to get you that citrus pop that you're looking for. So this is also what I was going to try this morning because I do have a pure in the fridge, but I wanted to do what Rob Hart had done on the show with kind of the Thai bitters and instead use grapefruit bitters with the pure and then compare the two, but maybe another time.
Yeah, I like to do that.
So, yeah.
It tends to be my favorite way to do sparkling water.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Okay, cool. So, PJ, with that out of the way, before we talk about the chapters, how are you feeling about this week's reading? What was your vibe?
I don't know. There were reveals, a lot of reveals this week, so it felt very satisfying, I guess, to read through it. Less things getting set up and more things get knocked over, which felt good.
Yeah, part of me, when I went back and read this week's reading, I was like, why didn't I make you read 44? And then at the same time, I went, the reason I didn't make you read 44 is because it feels very cheap, and even Brandon kind of admits that with the way that he treats Reen and the fact that the next chapter he rebuts this idea that Reen is Reen. So I didn't want to, linger in that for too long. So I know that that's why I made this decision, but I did seriously question it at the beginning of this week.
That's fair.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah, but that was a serious thought that I had. I really enjoy this week's reading because it is starting to just knock down dominoes. As you think about this book, right? We're approaching the end. This is a trilogy. We can't set up that many more dominoes to have them pay off at this point. It's got to be kind of the bulk back catalog, and we got to start paying everything off to make it worth it. So I think this is definitely a turning point where it's like, okay, now things just have to start falling so that we don't have an infinite number of pieces, on the jigsaw board.
Yeah.
It's not to say that everything gets resolved, but what? Makes sense? Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. Well, with that, we go into chapter 44. Starting off here, I love Vin's little trick with the guards and the use again of rioting and soothing. I feel like, especially early on, these metals were heavily underused and underrepresented among the allomantic capabilities. It's great to see brass and zinc really kind of in action here, being used to inflame an argument between, these guards and move them around inside of the scene.
Yeah, I think that there's a good reason why it's underused. A couple good reasons why. Early on, it's kind of established that at a high level, it's really difficult to make it subtle. And she's good at her luck right away at the beginning and being subtle with that. But she still gets noticed. And it just gets more and more noticeable. Even Breeze he doesn't even try to hide it most of the time. He just kind of is soothing people throughout the entire process. So making it subtle makes it a lot more difficult to use. And I think it's an inherently difficult thing to describe from a writing perspective. And make it not feel like mind control, but still describe exactly how it's working. Ultimately, I think Breeze's symphony scene in the last book, where was that? That was in Mistborn, in the first book, was a great training ground in that respect as far as writing some higher level soothing stuff. But Breeze is in the perfect scenario where he's kind of hidden in a back room and working on all this stuff, and it's been designed, the entire interaction has been designed around him doing that. It's not him out in the open working,
Yeah. And I think one of the other things to add in here is that a lot of this is also powered at least a little bit by Duralumin, right? So that's another reason that we don't really see it in the same way and not used as this sort of abject mind control, in which it kind of is a little bit, it's not mind control here, but it's a lot more forceful than it was previously. And like you said, I think the symphony is a great example. I think even thinking about the way in Well of Ascension that Breeze can't help but soothe people as he walks by. He's just always on and always helping with people's emotions. It is, I think it is also an inherently difficult thing to write. And so as such, I think Brandon got better at writing it as the series goes on, naturally. Mm-hmm. And presenting it. So yeah, it totally makes sense. I definitely agree with you. It's just, it's nice to see. So there's something lurking in the back of Vin's head, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute here as we get into kind of the idea. But Reen pops into her brain once again, asking herself, what would my brother say now about how she's doing in life, and reflecting on how he was protective of her despite being a poor kid in a bad situation. And just the general presentation of Reen shows up here as I think like a harder, faster reminder of who he was to service what we go into in a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, this reapproaching this with some hindsight changes things a little bit, because initially I really hadn't put a whole lot of thought into this interaction. But we really don't historically get a whole lot of Vin reflecting positively on Reen. We get once in a while, she gets some memories and the revelations of what Reen actually did for her, stuff like that. So this could be an example of some growth by Vin. But I can't help but wonder if this is an instance of soothing from Ruin. And that's kind of affecting the way that she's thinking about Reen and getting sort of primed for this interaction.
For me, I think it is more growth, more than anything else. I feel like it shows and presents itself as growth because she's mentally reflecting on it. And that is different than what we've been told Ruin can do, right? Ruin can't plant memories and be in your mind. So
can he though?
Well, that is a follow-up question to that extent. But
that's what I was saying, like coming at this with a little bit of hindsight based on what we learn later on. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and that's a fair enough point, and something that we can definitely get back into when we get there. I just feel like that this represents growth, I think, at least partially, because she has adjusted her thoughts towards Reen, and she acknowledges the bad, but recognizes the utility of what he was doing. And that utility being one of love, even in his own sacrifice in the end to the obligators.
Right.
We quickly go from this to Vin successfully distracting the guards, that, like we were talking about earlier, manipulating that soothing to get them kind of going against each other, soothing and rioting to flare that argument, and falls right into a trap in the Canton of Resource. And that's a big ol' oof considering here.
That's some shit.
Yeah.
That sucks. But it's so masterfully done. Like it is a perfect trap. Such a perfect trap.
Yeah. And it gives, I think it gives Yeoman a good chunk of like actual credit here too, is the great thing. It shows that he is a master strategist and very intelligent about how he approaches the whole operation. Yeah. So we move from there to Elend having a philosophical discussion with Yeoman. It's kind of nice to see, given these small chunks of the world and history here in dialogue, and to get to kind of see the two of these, what would you say? What would you call them? The philosophers, I guess you could say practicing philosophers, whichever way you want to, leaders, kind of go at it. Even if it is all meant to be a distraction for Vin at this point, I do want to say I've talked a lot about philosophy through the lens of Red Rising and, other series and other books. This feels a little surface level as far as I like my philosophical discussions to be in books, especially because it is mostly used as a lens to present history, not necessarily to debate philosophy, because they're debating in-world things that we are unaware of and just not. Yeah. I mean, there's obvious representation things that are here within kind of discussions around slavery and the enslavement of the ska and what's that mean? But I want a little bit more. I just always want to twist that knife.
So does Elend, though. Elend wants more.
Yeah.
Elend wants to get deeper into all of this, but he can't because he's trying to balance the attention of Yeoman and the attention of the crowd and maintaining this distraction for as long as he can. So there's this really surface level hitting as many points as possible to keep them engaged. So I think Elend would agree with you entirely on wanting something a little bit deeper.
That's a fair point. Okay. I'll give you that. I'll give you this soft philosophy as an exchange. All right. Fair enough.
I think he even says that he wants to get into it more.
He does, but I wouldn't take that as an excuse from a writer's perspective if you want to talk about philosophy. You know what I mean? You've got the open plate. You can run with it. Yeah.
Maybe it's a commentary on his audience as well.
Well, I don't think it is, because at this point Brandon didn't have the audience that he has now. But
I know,
That said, not everyone enjoys that in their fiction like I do. So it's fine. But yeah, okay. Anyway, I think great point on he has to entertain the crowd, because it definitely is something. Part of the reason that he isn't going in the directions that he wants to, or like citing texts as much, is because they start to lose people when they dive in on the like high level specifics. What do you think about kind of the way that this scene resolves with Elend going for Yeoman to test if he was an Allomancer?
Oh, it's a risk. That's a risky fucking thing. I think it was interesting that it was a very sudden decision, even from Ellen's perspective. Like, we've got his mind, we're understanding what he's doing, and it's still a snap decision, not even taking a moment to really wonder if he should trust his gut. There's a very slight pause where he's like, should I do this? But it's almost instantaneous, where he just kind of snaps and goes for it.
He just makes the call. Yeah. That's fair. And he's like, this might be the last chance that I get to do this. And so there's also that alternative of like, hey, and to that regard, he reacts because he's burning Atium and says that he's a Mistborn. Do you think that to be the case?
Well, now we know that it's possible to not necessarily have everything, but this is kind of the situation that I had put forward before, where we don't know, or we haven't met a strict Atium misting yet. But I think that could be very well the case, because there are no other signs that there are other metals being used at the moment. And Vin notes how, it was set up as a trap, so maybe that's not a relevant argument, but how it doesn't seem to be manipulated by iron or steel pushing or pulling. So I think it's entirely possible that he could just be in misting.
Yeah, and I don't know if we talked about this before, but it would be so expensive to test people to be an ATM misting. So the likelihood of them even knowing, for the most part, is null and void, unless you had a very specific reason that you would have been given ATM to burn.
Or a stockpile.
Yeah, or, canton of resource. And in theory, this is where the cache is supposed to be. So that all kind of lines up too.
Yeah, or... Yeah, he could have known from the get-go that he was, or from before, and had his own stockpile that he's been saving up.
Oh, yeah, there's that too. He openly flaunts it too with the bead on his head. So there's something about that sort of representation of power, where he's got that tied on a cord around his head. So we end our perspective from Elend with a letter informing him that Vin is trapped. We move back to Vin trying to break out when she's confronted with a ghastly visage of a ghost of her brother, Reen.
Yeah, I was so sure for the longest time that Zane was going to be Reen. So I was pretty ready for Reen to show up in a physical form, even if it's strictly a trick here. I wasn't that surprised that there was a physical form of Reen, because I had been prepared for it for a long time.
That's fair. It isn't. That's the other reason that I didn't think that this was like a great place to end on, is because I don't think it's not climactic and it's not anticlimactic, but it's somewhere in the middle, where it's like, this is these seeds have been planted for a while. Reen has been here the whole time in the back of her head in this story. So it's like, we've gotten to know him. Now it's just a matter of actually seeing this personification of him. And I think calling it a personification is probably the best way to address it before we get into the specifics of what's going on. So with that, we go into part 4. We end part 3 and we go to part 4, Beautiful Destroyer. I really like this part title, just from the idea, like, it is so Coheed and Cambria that, and maybe really it's just because it's on my brain, but it is. It's like, this is just perfectly on the nose in that same way. And I really like it. And it is kind of a conflux of these ideas about what, what's to come, maybe.
Yeah. Who's
thoughts?
The Beautiful Destroyer? Is it all of them? Is it everybody?
Well, and I think from Rune's perspective that we get a little bit later, he thinks there's beauty in destruction and finds that to be the way that the reason that everything matters. So there's, it's interesting. We'll definitely talk about that more when we get to Rune, but I think that's at least partially a tie-in here.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. With that, we go into chapter 45. We've got our logbook. A man with a given power, such as an allomantic ability, who then gained a hemalurgic spike granting that same power, would be nearly twice as strong as a natural, unenhanced allomancer. An inquisitor who was a seeker before his transformation would therefore have an enhanced ability to use bronze. This simple fact explains how many inquisitors were able to pierce copper clouds.
So that's what her earring is for.
Yeah.
I was so convinced that it was going to be ferrochemical in a way. This makes a whole lot more sense. And also leads to some more questions about the Lord Ruler and his metal, because it's described as he has his ferrochemical bracelets and things, and some of them are embedded in his skin, they say, in order to stop people from being able to pull on them, which is true and works that way. But I wonder if it wasn't strictly ferrochemical and if there were some hemalurgical spikes in there as well mixed in.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point and great question. He knows. I think especially when we get into the plate and kind of that whole reading that we get with him kind of recanting that's been in each of these rooms, right? Each of these basements, which is why Vin has it memorized despite feeling the whole thing. That's when we get into maybe some of those complications where maybe he was aware. He was very aware of the power of hemalurgy. We even kind of get that from our narrator, the Hero of Ages, which is just how I should be referring to them. I don't know why I've been calling them the narrator, because in reality they're the Hero of Ages.
Right.
Yeah.
That said, this earring, it makes me wonder about the mechanics of the spikes in general, because there are times when she doesn't have it in, and it's such a small spike. So hypothetically, that would mean it would leak power very quickly. Or is it only leaking immediately until it's embedded in someone and then it stops leaking altogether, even if they take it out? I don't know. Also, the prospect of killing somebody with that earring in order to like imbue it with power makes me wonder if it's maybe possible to like shear off parts of a spike.
Like shear off parts of a spike?
Yeah. And maintain power that way. I don't know. A lot of sort of mechanical questions, going off the presumption that that spike is exactly what's giving her the power described in this logbook entry.
I want to feed into something that I know we talked about a little bit offline the other day regarding Zane. You had a note that you talked about to me about Zane when you called me the other day.
Oh, yeah. So he's got that spike, and I think it would be safe to assume that it'd be steel because of his ability to levitate.
Yeah, I think that feels like a safe assumption, and I don't mean to like stretch here, but as the book starts to confirm these things, it's just like, I don't want to go. Here's the thing. I don't want to go until the end of the story to have some of these things that are planted here be fully confirmed. They will be confirmed for you. I mean, rather they are, but you came to this on your own terms, which is important. And I just want to make sure that you got the moment to kind of say that and espouse your theory, your statement.
Be right.
Yeah, to be right. Yeah. I mean, you weren't right to begin with. You just thought he was a stronger allomancer, but
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Totally. Okay, moving on. First off, I love Sanderson's use of the term fitful lantern light here. And it's as though it's like spasming very gently on the ground behind Ruin here. I think it's great, of course, that we go right into this and we see, this whole thing. But I love that little description.
Yeah, I mean, that's when what you think of, or at least that's what I think of when I imagine a dark cave and like a suspenseful scene of people walking in a dark cave. It's always flickery. It's not like a just straight lantern light or torchlight that it probably typically gives off. It's always that sort of flickery, dramatic characteristic that is being evoked here.
It makes the whole thing more spectral. Like it adds to this like very. I think in particular, this is such a great example of how a couple of words can be so easily skimmed over and skipped over, and you could totally miss out on the description of the scene here. But this adds this sort of cinematic presentation of this ghost in the cave, this dark cave, with like the spasming light there on the ground. And It's just great. I love it.
Mhm.
I love it. Thank you, Brandon. So this version of Reen raises many, many questions, and many of them are simultaneously answered as we go through this chapter. In the same way that Brandon didn't want to mess with our heads for us too long here, I didn't want to mess with yours, kind of like I said. But what did you make of Reen being ruined for potentially a very long time?
I mean, you know me and my sort of tendency to get a little bit meta with my answers. So heads up, I'm going to do that again. But Vin makes it pretty obviously clear that this doesn't fall perfectly in line with the rules as we have set forward with us. And it's impossible that everything that Reen has said in the past is strictly from Ruin because of the mind reading thing. And that seems like a point of clear like misdirection or misunderstanding of the rules from Vin's perspective. But at the same time, I don't think it's necessarily a problem, even within this rule set, because it was described that Ruin very specifically picked out a few people to influence and to kind of keep marks on. So even before she knew that she was a Mistborn and she was working as this sort of street urchin with Reen, Ruin could have witnessed all of those interactions and could have known everything about Vin's perception of and interactions with Reen, to the point where Ruin would be able to emulate that in Vin's mind.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what she's alluding to, right? Is this given or understanding based on the perspective, kind of like you're saying, of the rules. Her understanding is that, yeah, this thing has been following her around for a lot longer than originally thought. But
she also says that it couldn't have possibly all been Ruin because it's in her mind. Oh, because I think she's saying because it reacts sometimes to her thoughts and sort of gives different responses to just things that she's thinking. And that's where I think it's clear to me that they don't have all the rules correct. And he is able to influence minds and is able to influence.
My ask to you, and maybe this might be personal, but I don't know how your self-talk goes, but when you're like talking yourself, this is such a strange thing to like pick at, but with myself, when I'm like picking at something that I think I've done poorly or that I could do better, it is like people going back and forth and like talking to each other, and one's generally demeaning and one's like, well, you tried that and you do this and blah blah blah.
Yeah, but whose voice is that in?
Often,
Is that in your own voice? Or is it a disembodied voice of somebody else?
I'm not paying attention.
Because I think that's
enough attention to myself.
I think that's something completely different, because this is clearly Reen's voice speaking in her mind.
Sure.
Not just sort of the echoes of things that
But if you had a traumatic if you had a very traumatic experience with someone of whom I can imagine, this is kind of my stretch here, right? Like I can imagine her devil on her shoulder internally, or angel and devil on her shoulder internally, is her brother because he was a devil in real life.
Okay. I can see that.
Yeah. I'm not saying that you're full on wrong or anything. I'm just saying, like, I feel like that's a very real reaction. My self-talk voice, I think, is myself because I'm an egotist, but
I don't know if I've never heard of anybody's self-talk be any, like, I've never heard somebody describe it as somebody else's voice.
That's fair. Yeah. Sweet.
So I don't think it's because you're an egotist. That's just true.
I mean, separate facts. That's fine. I love that we track the pulsing here too, like, as well. It's the same kind of thing. The same pulsing that Vin felt at the well. But then once she calls it what it is, and it, of course, being Reen and Ruin, he switches and begins to espouse his intent and purpose here. What do you make of our villain monologue, as much as it kind of is here? It's a conversation, but, it's kind of a monologue. What do you make of this sort of espousing of intent?
I think it's an intriguing prospect.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that Ruin is less of this malicious entity and more of a natural process which has been held at bay for too long and kind of needs to catch up. I think there might be some middle ground there. Ruin is a force of nature, but can't act unilaterally, needs to have this working in conjunction with preservation in order to achieve the proper balance. And I think thinking about this more specifically in the context of ruin being one of the driving forces of life, there is no progression or creation. It is ruin and then preservation. So it is maintain and destroy, and then life and production and evolution happens naturally out of those processes. So there needs to be this decay in order to make room for natural growth. And preservation is what allows that growth to happen without decaying itself too quickly. I really like that sort of idea of balance and this idea of natural forces not including evolution or progression, but the two actual forces being sort of destruction and maintaining.
Yeah, no follow-up.
Okay, cool.
And in that, I mean, like, that was a great way to put it, and I mean, strictly no words, but I think that you've hit the nail on the head as to why I think that these two godly entities are so interesting and fascinating inside of the story. It's what really gives it a very interesting touch to the world, and even the kind of ideas behind it. So yeah, love it.
I think you can also apply it to society and the fact that ruin has been dormant or kept at bay for so long. So everything has been under the influence of preservation. So as we talked before, culture hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Fashion hasn't changed. And we've attributed that to the Lord Ruler and things that he's been imposing on people. But it's entirely possible at this point that there was nothing driving the destruction of anything, and therefore nothing driving the need for evolution.
Yeah. One power really outweighing the other in the world. And that's how you get this 1,000-year, stopgap or like air gap, basically, of improvement. Mm-hmm. Because nothing decayed, so there was nothing to improve against necessarily.
Yeah, what is it? Innovation is born out of necessity.
Yeah. Necessity and low resource, something like that. I think there's like a short quote and then there's a full quote, and it's
Or what is it? Necessity is the mother of creation, or of
mother
invention?
of innovation.
Innovation. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Totally. Cool. All right. So that's it for chapter 45, our little confrontation with Ruin there. Anything else that you wanted to say? We get more in kind of the logbooks here about Ruin, but...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's just...
Sure.
I think we can... I think we have enough to talk about going forward. We'll be able to circle back.
That's fair. So, moving into chapter 46, logbook here. Rune's escape deserves some explanation. This is a thing that even I had a problem understanding. Rune could not have used the power at the Well of Ascension. It was of preservation, Rune's fundamental opposite. Indeed, a direct confrontation of these two forces would have caused the destruction of both. Rune's prison, however, was fabricated of that power. Therefore, it was attuned to the power of preservation, that very power of the Well. When that power was released and dispersed, rather than utilized, it acted as a key. The subsequent unlocking is what finally freed Ruin.
Yeah, so this very clearly debunks my theory that there's two wells. Or, not entirely, but mostly. Mostly breaks that down, along with, I think it's another logbook later on, talking about this whole deal. But anyway... For the most part, that theory's been cut down at the knees. There is something that's sticking out in my mind that I'm kind of curious about, and that's sort of the idea that allomancy is of preservation and hemalurgy is of ruin, but hemalurgy seems to induce allomantic power. So is that still of preservation, or is that strictly separate and they produce the same results but just come from different sources?
I think it's important to remember that Hemalurgy steals. So that's the capability. And because everyone contains a little bit of preservation like we got last week as this description, it's just stealing and accumulating. So it would steal allomantic capabilities, meaning it is of ruin.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Because they are ruins. They're using ruins power. It's as though it's captured in something, right? So that power has been taken into something else. And so it's been made into because it's been captured by ruins power. It is ruins power, but it is a representation of preservation's power. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You could do a lot of shit with Hemalurgy, is the point.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's great to see that Breeze and Sazed shift their opinion on Spook over the course of this week's reading. Confronting this idea that the child has become a man, I think, is huge for him, and the way that they kind of build him up, and huge for his personal growth on all fronts. I do, of course, want to just pick at the fact that Breeze here in the beginning, and even Spook, is like a little leery of this idea of even comparing Spook to Kelsier. But they get over that in a chapter. So,
yeah. I think similarly, this is kind of a huge deal for Sazed and Breeze themselves. Sazed specifically, he's been in this really weird place. So recognizing a positive change and having that on his mind could be really good for him, I think.
Yes, totally. I definitely think it's really good for him. I think it's a great turn because it's the beginning of Sazed kind of coming out of this depressive shell. And it's not to say that he solved it or anything, but it is his beginning to unravel that a little bit and try to pick at exactly why he is. And this all started last week when Breeze confronted him on the idea of, would Tyndall want you to do this? She wouldn't want you to be this way. That's where this begins. So after leaving that conversation, I appreciate Sazed's turn to focus on religion once again to make progress on this journey he wants to go through. So he picks up a religion, that of Trell and the Nelizan people, that I think is really interesting because it's based in like a quasi-scientific theory approach, as opposed to a culture that led with its doctrine and that is defined by the doctrine first. It makes for something really interesting, and I love the description of it being kind of whimsical here too.
Yeah. Have we been exposed to Trell?
Yes. It's the stars. It's the 1,000 stars in the sky because they're focused on astronomy, right? So I think it was in the first book is when we're originally exposed to it.
Yeah, I think it was to Kelsier, one of the religions he pitched to Kelsier.
Yes, I think so.
That said, there are some comments that seem so very pointed from Branderson in this section, and that's this specifically. What good was a religion without answers? Why believe in something if the response to half of his questions was ask Trell and he will answer? And I mean, that's just kind of most modern religions in general. Anything with sort of a deity at its core kind of deals with that central sort of thing. So I'm assuming we'll see Sazed sort of go down a redemption path of sorts and let him sort of embrace the unknown and unanswerable to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I think that's why I bring this up here is because this is the reason that I think Sazed also even says that he himself gravitated towards it is because, in that he liked this one so much, is because it has this kind of blanket approach, right? It has a more open-ended approach. And I think that's also what Breeze is trying to pick at a little bit later here in the next chapter, where he confronts him on the religion thing a little bit more strictly and sort of this idea of the knowledge that he contains. I think this is what he's really trying to get at is it's not about having all the answers. It's about having one potential set of answers.
Mm-hmm.
And then confronting and using that to adjust. It's a fascinating conversation, which is why I wanted to point it out here. So we move from there to Spook confronting Beldra, and man, does this not go the way that he wants it to. He is kind of this, he's a kid, right? We don't want to necessarily, I guess he's an 18-year-old or 17-year-old at this point, but he's young, and I find it very interesting that he starts off with a really assumptive foot by basically espousing all of his thoughts. He's like, here are all the facts. Here's my conspiracy theory brain working at overdrive. Here are the answers. And, that's a very youthful thing to do, to assume everything and then to put that on someone else and be like, this is the way you're behaving the way that you are. before Beldra calls him a simplistic fool and calls the guards with a scream.
Yeah. There is just so much optimism and confidence. It's so clear that this is a teenage boy in his logic. Like, he's a smart kid, but fuck, dude, like, that is exactly how a teenage boy thinks. When he knows he's right.
Right. And that was just, for me, it was just like, oh man, dude. And the other part of this to think of and remember is that, like, she sees him as this, like, almost sort of superhero-y person. So if we think about the other perspective from Beldra, she is seeing this guy who's, like, jumped out of a building with a kid, like, saved these people, actively working to undo these things. She's got this almost like superhero perspective, and in a way should kind of be afraid because he seems super capable and, you know, very mysterious in a similar way to Kelsier from the outside.
Yeah.
Like, that's what he's building up. So why would he expect her? You know, it's just a funny conflict of expectations here between the two of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we go back to Sazed and his metal mines. And for me, even trying to write this question, it was a mess. So I'm just going to kind of go and then we'll deal with it. But we go back to Sazed and his metal mines, reflecting on when he last used them and reflecting on their many uses. He also states that there are only 50 religions remaining and feels like he shouldn't use the metal mines, that it would be kind of breaking his oath, despite all of kind of the ideas. I really appreciate, after the internal conversation, how Breeze intervenes and really pushes on him and on why he isn't using them as the last of the keepers. This is kind of an important thing. And Sazed even recounts to him, before he's pressed further by Breeze, I am probably the last of the keepers. The thoughts in these metal mines will die with me, and at times I can't make myself regret that fact. This is not an era for scholars and philosophers. Scholars and philosophers do not feed starving children. This, I think, is a great point, especially as we think about Elend in the same time. And this is the same sort of conclusion that he's came to.
Yeah. But so a few different things in this Mistborn question, as you said.
Paragraph.
He's somehow still this sad boy character, but he's more nuanced about it, if that makes sense. We get some insight into why he's acting the way that he is. And he starts to break that down a little bit too, and he starts allowing some concessions to the promises that he's made for himself because he felt like he should make those promises to himself. And at the very least, those thoughts and those driving promises are at the forefront of his mind. But I'm hoping that he's going to start seeing that line, scholars and philosophers do not feed starving children, is just false with this respect, because he is the only one with the means to go through this sort of engineering process for the waterways, and will ultimately save a lot of lives. Maybe not feed starving children explicitly like he's saying, but he could, given the things that he knows. Like, he needs to maintain this knowledge because this knowledge is what drives society forward.
Yeah, he's totally proving himself wrong. And I think that's kind of the thing here. Over the course of the week, I should say, right? Like, he's proving the utility and the futility of his previous position as Spook pushes him to actually wear these and do the things. Starting, I mean, right now, it's him blowing up that meeting and pushing on Sazed to really kind of use that information, right? To fill the street slots with water, like you're saying. That's the whole purpose, is to be like, hey, man, you're a repository for a lot of things. You're the last keeper, probably. And we have to ensure, you have this information, use it instead of just sitting on your thumb and,
Yeah, imagine if he had just decided not to.
Yeah, right.
Stuck his head in the sand and really, just was obstinate about it. I think we'd be in a much more dire place.
Yeah,
in general, right. I think Sazed doing this is a morale boost for Breeze and
Alrianne.
Yeah, and Alrianne, because she is there and matters, I guess. I fucking hate her. I really don't like that character.
I mean, I know Lindsay does too. That was what she was alluding to. But I like Alrianne. It's fine.
Okay,
fine.
I can't even like really nail down why I don't like her. I think I could probably like, part. I don't know. I don't trust her, and I don't feel like she's done anything to earn that trust.
Fair. Really?
Yeah.
The whole like tricking her dad into like doing the right thing
to save Breeze.
Yeah, and everyone else. I think she says something like, "Breezy, I did as best as I could," or something like that in her like to herself, right? To that point, though, she's working in the best interests of Breeze, is working in the best interests of the crew in that moment. Like,
I mean, as a side effect,
it's not just Breeze. I don't know if that's the intent. Because I think if she really wanted to, she could knock Breeze out and like drag him on a horse, and like he wouldn't be able to do anything. You know what I mean? Like he'd be fine.
Yeah.
I think she's trying to do right by Breeze and his kind of choices and actions and what he wants to stand for. It's fine. Cool. This is just another sticking point inside of this book. That and the fucking dress. Okay, so chapter 47 here. We've got our first long book of the week. Nice long logbook that takes up most of a page. So, Ruin's prison was not like those that hold men. He wasn't bound by bars. In fact, he could move about freely. His prison, rather, was one of impotence. In terms of forces and gods, this meant balance. If Ruin were to push, the prison would push back, essentially rendering Ruin powerless. And because much of his power was stripped away and hidden, he was unable to affect the world in any but the most subtle of ways. I should stop here and clarify something. We speak of Ruin being freed from his prison, but that is misleading. Releasing the power at the well tipped the aforementioned balance back toward Ruin, but he was still too weak to destroy the world in the blink of the eye as he yearned to do. This weakness was caused by part of Ruin's power, his very body, having been taken and hidden from him, which was why Ruin became so obsessed with finding the hidden part of his self.
So this is just more confirmation and more clear understanding of what these godly beings are, as described early on. I think maybe in the first book, maybe the second, I can't remember what, talking about, or maybe it was even like at the beginning of this book. I don't know. Previously on Mistborn, it was described as the power of a god and the body of a god are the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So this feeds into that even more. And so basically Ruin is looking for his body and looking for his power, and that's the deal. Wherever preservation hit it, I still think within humanity in general, but we'll see.
Yeah. Interesting. And I mean, there are some things to work out here, right, from this kind of idea. But I think an important part to say here is that like this idea that this is how Ruin was able to influence Vin despite being locked in the well, right? Is because he wasn't completely trapped. He was mostly, like, he couldn't do a whole lot, but he could exert some influence. And we get even more specific information on that with the chapter 51 logbook entry this week.
Yeah, what was do you have that one written down?
I forget if it was long or not. Yeah,
you have it written.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Rather, maybe it's 50. Yeah, no, sorry, it's chapter 50's logbook, not 51, which is, this idea that he was very cautious and careful and approached things very methodically to pull off what he was trying to pull off.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So with that, back to chapter 47. This is a pretty quick chapter. There's not a ton to talk about, but we go to Elend, spending some time worrying about Vin and Yeoman. Elend is interrupted in his thoughts about Vin in the mist by Set, who really flashes a moment of emotional honesty, talking about the likelihood of Vin's survival.
Okay. I feel weird about this section because of the way that Elend approaches this and how starkly different it would have been if Vin was there.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the tables were turned. Because she very obviously, I feel like, would have done whatever to run and save him, especially considering how everything backfired the last time she tried to like go against her instinct to save him and like do good by the rest of the world and the rest of humanity. And it just fucking backfired. So I don't think she'd give up that opportunity again. And he seems to be not doing the same thing specifically, but it's a similar sort of idea. Like he's just given up. Like he's resigned to the idea that he can just run in and save her directly, and is just like, I can't do anything about this.
I think it also speaks to their difference of utility as Mistborns. Vin's utility would be a rescue mission, like an abject, risky rescue mission, because she could pull it off, probably, comparatively. Elend is still a novice, but he's like a sledgehammer novice in a way, because he's got these like incredibly more powerful and, the base allomantic abilities at a much higher level. So, yeah, I think that this is in our own characteristic way, like we're assessing this. Elend in this moment is more like, well, he's leaning into his strengths. I think that's the way to look at it. Is his strength lies with command, and Mistborn is kind of a secondary trait, nature.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense.
Yeah. So he brings up, he being said, also brings up another interesting note, that of loyalty being the basis for command, and how he looks up to Elend for what he's managed to accomplish. What a sweet old asshole, it's kind of a nice little moment.
Yeah, Set's tune is changing a little bit here. He's always thought of Elend as a good person, but has never thought of him as a good leader because of him being a good person. And now he's starting to really notice where those good person traits can be utilized. And how am I trying to say this?
I think of it like I think of it like a waterfall. Like here's our complications, and here's the long-term effects of being a good leader, of whom doesn't demand respect through fear, but commands it through, doing the right thing more often than not. And that's kind of the trickle down. I hate that using that term here, but that's kind of the trickle down of what he's seeing. And so over time, Set's been convinced that this is a good call, because he has to do less to rein in people, and sees difference in action where people underneath him would not have listened the same.
Right.
Yeah. Kind of the trickle down. I hate trickle down leadership. I hate that, but it's fun. But the trickle-down leadership doesn't go as well as we think. There's a Mistfallen incident with Demu and Bilg. And Bilg is that guy that fought Demu in the cave all the way back in Book 1 when Kelsier was influencing him. What'd you make of the infighting among the army and Elend's decision to send them away to Luthadel, as well as to execute this a-hole, Bilg, who started that fight by punching his general?
So somehow that decision seems right. And I feel like it's still going to come back and bite him in the ass. But in the moment, it feels like the right decision. I'm not sure where that faction will go, but I don't think they'll ever get reintegrated. And maybe not even in a positive way, but they'll diverge. Like, I'd go as far as saying that I could see this becoming an adversarial sort of potentially. Like, it's outcasts dealing with outcasts exclusively, and it can just become an echo chamber and become problematic. And who knows where that will, like, they don't have anybody leveling them, checking them outside of like people in the exact same boat as they are. So I could see that becoming a problem down the line. But in the moment, there's more complication. Because of this decision to execute this guy. And it's the proper punishment that was set forward, but at the same time, it was done to send a message. And that message was to not fuck with your fellow, like, don't attack a superior, first of all. But the idea that infighting won't be tolerated, but simultaneously you're just separating all the people that are sort of the cause of this infighting. Could that breed resentment among the group? Like, what's going to happen there? Like, what is going to happen to morale on both fronts? I don't think is in a stable place and could potentially go bad pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment of where we're kind of left, right? Is that this is a very difficult decision that is made. And one of the things that I find I don't want to say disheartening, but like a little bit kind of an unfortunate side effect of the position that we're in is it feels like it is the best move, but it doesn't feel like the move that even Elend wants to make, right? And I'm not saying from the execution standpoint. He doesn't want to make the execution, but he understands that it's necessary. I think sending them away is something that he wouldn't do if he weren't facing kind of all the circumstances he is. And Penrod does need assistance. Like, he is doing the right thing as well for the Empire on the whole. But at the same time, he's also creating a potential line or division there and reinforcing it by making the separation.
Yeah. I think we made comment, or at least maybe you and I made comment about it off air, I'm not sure, when Elend executed Jostes, that there was sort of a Ned Stark sort of vibe to it. And this execution feels even more like that. But like you're saying, it's the best move, but it's not a good move. Like, there's no good moves here.
Yeah, it's a tough call to make. I did want to just add a little kind of appended note to the end of this. If you listen to the audiobook, typically audiobooks are just done, with the kind of initial final draft handed off there. This was something that Brandon actually changed between drafts, between publications rather, and printings. So in the very first draft, Elend says it isn't Bilg, it's Brill, but that's because he doesn't really know the dude's name, and so it's supposed to be kind of like a off kilter, but you're supposed to know that it's him because they have the history and the way that he's described. They actually did change the name from Brill to Bilg just to make that more clear in the second printing. So reading it, you see Bilg. Listening to it, you hear Brill.
Okay. I think
just to give that connection.
That's too much of an obfuscation.
That's why I think he tried to make it more abject, more clear. So with that, we go into chapter 48 here. We've got our logbook. Once freed, Rune was able to affect the world more directly. The most obvious way he did this was by making the ash mounts emit more ash and the earth begin to break apart. As a matter of fact, I believe that much of Rune's energy during those last days were dedicated to these tasks. He was also able to affect and control far more people than before. Where he had once influenced only a few select individuals, he could now direct entire Koloss armies.
So those last days is a fun development because we get some direct talk about what's being done, and that paired with a previous logbook talking about the end of the world and how it brought the end of the world. Makes me feel like that was a lot more literal than what I initially chalked it up to be. I don't know if I can go into farther detail of what I'm thinking here.
Like, you don't have anything more to connect on?
No, I have more to connect on, but I don't think I should bring it up because it deals with Elantris. Here's an issue that we're going to start to run into with Cosmere connected novels. And this is why I did, in theory, want to save Elantris until after we were done. However, it just fit into the schedule really well. All right. Here's what we're going to do. Listeners of whom are listening to this live, this is what we sometimes do. PJ, we're going to clap. You can go through it. We'll determine at the end if we keep it, and then we'll clap back. Sounds good.
Okay. All right.
So if this section makes it in, this is strictly sort of
Elantris spoilers.
Elantris spoilers. It's quick. It's not a whole lot, but we know that there's sort of a portal, presumably, through the wells between Elantris. What's the name of that planet?
Nalthis or Cell. Yeah.
Cell, whatever. That planet and Scadrial.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about the end of the world and knowing that there is a portal potentially back the other direction means that it's conceivable. And my current working theory that this Hero of Ages is no longer on Scadrial because Scadrial doesn't exist anymore. And they're in Cell.
Okay.
Or a different planet. Nalthis. Whatever.
Sure.
But they have taken a portal away from Scadrial, and then it ended.
Okay. I don't think that's wild. I think from a writer's perspective, that would be a little Deus Ex for the story, but on the Cosmere side, anything's possible.
It's just making it seem less of a hyperbole to call it the end of the world, given that we're talking about fracturing the internals of the planet and expanding the reach of the ash mounts. Like, it feels apocalyptic in the most like real way.
The most literal sense, yeah. And the hero is definitely not downplaying that whatsoever. They are absolutely leaning into that here.
So that's what I had.
Okay.
Cool.
So we spend time in this chapter with Vin here working out her specific thoughts on what and how exactly Ruin had been able to manipulate her, and potentially others as well, including Zane from the Well of Ascension. What do you think of these reveals?
I think the stacks on more of the information that we've been given, and thoughts on his power and how limited it actually is, and choosing very specific people to influence. We talk at one point about the timeline of gods. I think that's later again in a later logbook. We've referenced it a couple times now, but the timeline of gods and how precise things have to be. But with such a long timeline, it's entirely possible that his influence had been on Vin from birth, basically, from the point of knowing that she was this powerful being and powerful allomancer and had so much potential. So I don't know. It's just more evidence stacking on top of each other about like how interconnected everything is.
And I think that, to your point on this all stacking together, that final logbook, basically communicates to achieve such things, he apparently began with people who already had a tenuous grip on reality, right? And Zane fits that description because of the abuse he had experienced, and lines up perfectly with the type of person that he would lean into. So
that's working off of that would assume that Ruin came after that, as opposed to like at birth.
Oh, yeah, I understand. So, right.
Yeah, that, I don't know. Either way, early influences.
So, waiting in this cave, she was looking for something new, but instead stumbled into something old, something we haven't been able to fully read before. Text, the final text from the Lord Ruler. What did you think of this full metal plate inscription that we get here? We've gotten a couple of different pieces of it, really just the beginning, because they're like, oh, this is the same one we read last time. But this time, she gives us all the words.
For one thing, he talks about voices. Not voice, but multiple voices, plural. Which is, I mean, either I'm reading way too far into it and it's just kind of the way that he's speaking, or it's something much more complicated than what we've been dealing with so far. I think it's maybe possible that Preservation has a voice as well that was influencing Lord Ruler, and there was sort of a conflict and balance there. It does give more credence to the idea that the Lord Ruler was strictly and very, very strictly thinking about the best way to preserve the world from extinction at the hands of ruins, as opposed to properly leading his people. And like basically just strictly saying like, I'm not going to concern myself with my constituents at all, because this is way bigger than them. And that is abject apathy, but is it malice? Is an interesting sort of thought to go down.
And that great point. I think that the only example that you can really point to that feels malicious happened near the beginning, right? When he was still Rashek, who'd picked up the powers and hadn't really grown to become the Lord Ruler. That sounds weird to say, but when his mind became enlightened, one of the first things he did is he like whipped out and punished people, right? Like that's with his godhood, he created the Ska, seemingly from the Klenni people, most likely from the Klenni people, as this sort of way of getting back at them for what he perceived as slights, and then also proceeded to slight his own people for fear of them coming for the power or explaining what he was doing, which would have undermined him and his goal to preserve, the world. And that makes for a much more... It's super fucked. It makes for a very complicated first book. In terms of voices, the way that I think about this is that if Ruin has 1,000 years with the Lord Ruler because he's hemalurgically impaled, which we assume is where the voices are coming from, right? Because he's got the spikes in him, or like you were kind of saying, the rings earlier. The voices to me feel like ways of manipulating guilt, right? And like trying to turn in the same way that like the book is the Elendi's journal is manipulated in theory, or could have been manipulated. I just have this feeling of the sneaking suspicion that Ruin in these moments was likely pushing on his emotions by representing the people that went up that mountain with him, or representing like his father being, upset at him, or, whatever, any number of examples. And I think of that as voices, as different angles to try to manipulate.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it's all Ruin, but Ruin taking on different characters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like that's the move, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But, Vin focuses in on one bit of text from the plate, text from the very bottom. I have hidden his body well. What do you think that this could be pointing towards? And this is 110% a prediction.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So what we were talking about before, how Ruin's body is missing, and we had been, or at least I had been, attributing it to, and Ruin, I think, is attributing it to preservation, hiding it from him. But this, I guess, kind of points to the idea that this was the Lord Ruler's doing. And maybe it was the Lord Ruler acting as a conduit through which preservation's will was being done. But I don't know. If we're going to ignore exactly the conversation that we just had about all the voices being of Ruin, we could assume that preservation was influencing the Lord Ruler and directing him how to hide Ruin's body.
I don't think it's mutually exclusive to say that preservation couldn't have had a similar effect. I don't think that we have anything textually to say that preservation wouldn't be doing something similar. So I'm not going to... I don't think our conversation about the voices points to that being wrong, but it does point to this it being a hard thing for the Lord Ruler to sort out. If there was a good, it's like, am I listening to the devil on my shoulder? Is there an angel on my shoulder? Am I doing the right thing? Very, very tough position to be in for the Lord Ruler. Yeah, man. And I love your description of sort of the apathy in a way that he had to have in order to preserve the world, which makes so much sense. Love it. Okay. So the door opens, and we'll get back to that in a moment here. All right. That's kind of where the chapter ends, so with the door opening. But we'll get to Teldin and that conversation in just a minute.
Sounds good.
So we go into chapter 49 here. We've got our logbook. One might ask why Ruin couldn't have used the Inquisitors to release him from his prison. The answer to this is simple enough if one understands the workings of power. Before the Lord Ruler's death, he maintained too tight a grip on them to let Ruin control them directly. Even after the Lord Ruler's death, however, such a servant of Ruin could never have rescued him. The power in the well was of preservation, and an Inquisitor could only have taken it by first removing his hemalurgic spikes. That, of course, would have killed him. Thus, Ruin needed a much more indirect way to achieve his purpose. He needed someone he hadn't tainted too much, but someone he could lead by the nose, carefully manipulating. I love that we get such a fascinating, deep description of ferrochemy here and how knowledge extracted leaves this void when it's placed back into the metal mines. The biggest use is transcription so that the data doesn't corrupt or wear down, and like this idea that like you pull it in your mind and then you write it down really fast and then you put it back in. I just love, I think it's great.
Yeah. I feel like in the past, I had pretty effectively and comprehensively picked up how this all worked. Good to have sort of actual confirmation and a little bit more concretely tied down mechanics of it. But my one question is still sort of the wear down mechanic that he describes. Is that described earlier about why it wears down?
No, just that it does. I think it's because
it's live, basically. And he has to remember.
Yeah. And I also like the idea of it wearing down beyond the actual technical capabilities or reasons that it happens. I like the idea of it wearing down because it makes it much more like a hard drive. And we've described ferrochemy, in particular copper mines, as very robotic and even like reacting in a robotic way. So it's just kind of a fun duplicate to me in that way, and like a aligning of, we've seen when Tindwyl and Sazed were going through their copper mines, they're, just robots, rigid and kind of just sitting there on the ground frozen when Elend walked in back in the Well of Ascension. So, yeah, I just enjoy that comparison. So I think it's important to point out Breeze and chat about him for a second. He's in much better place now than that he was at the end of the Well of Ascension. It almost feels like he's coming into his own as a person, and as chuggy as it is, living life to the fullest. I really like their conversation about Sazed's interest now that he's re-engaged with his interest in learning and sort of esotericisms. I think is really great. To quote here, Sazed, how is it that you can be so wise in so many areas, yet be so completely stupid about this? A man is what he has passion about. I've found that if you give up what you want most for what you think you should want more, you'll end up miserable. This is maybe the most direct that Brandon speaks to the audience in any of these books. I think this feels like a direct thing that he pulled out of himself, and this conversation even feels like him justifying why he should be a writer, like in a way, right? Because if you drop that passion, even though there's so many other writers, there's so many other storytellers, so many other people who could go and find stories anywhere, this feels like the argument against dropping the thing that you love, and feels to me like the most direct, out of the box sentiment. Yeah,
that's fair. And I think it's more important than that textually as well, which is kind of a sudden comparison that I'm being struck with.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's both. I have no problem saying that. I just mean it also feels like the most direct out of audience address.
Yeah, totally fair. But specifically, I'm kind of struck with the idea that this is likening... How do I want to put this? This is kind of bringing up the fact that Sazed is a eunuch, and he's constantly referring to himself as less than a man, and sort of mirroring that and extending that to a different definition of manhood. As Breeze brings up, saying, "What is it? A man is what he has passion about, and if all of his passions are gone, it's sort of likened to that." I could make that comparison. I don't know. That's just kind of...
Yeah, no, I think that this is a textually deep and rich thing to have thrown in here. I think that that's a great comparison too, because it's like you aren't what you're like necessitated by society to be, which is, I think, a great comparison to the manhood thing, right? Like not being able, like being a eunuch doesn't define him in the same way that, like, I know what you're going for. I'm just trying to connect it to. Additionally, I think we're probably good with what you said.
Yeah, I think it's less. I think it's more will be used as a motivation, knowing that like that's something that's always in the back of his mind, and that could be more motivation to bring back his passions in the way that Breeze wants him to.
Yeah, well, and right now he's trying to be something that he's not, right? Like I think that's the other thing here is that he's trying to be logical, like Tindwyl would be, to go through his religions and to like scrape through all of these things, which is killing his passions because he feels like that's the thing that he has to do, versus instead being, the esoteric and kind of engaged person he is with his metal mines. So I think that feeds in.
Yeah,
cool. All right. What do you make of both of them pointing to Spook and seeing reflections of who Kelsier was and how he behaved and acted? I think this is kind of a fun thing that pops up in this chapter.
So I think it certainly makes a more complicated argument about whether or not Spook is actually being possessed by Kelsier here. What it potentially evokes for me, going under the assumption that it's not actually Kelsier and it's Ruin impersonating Kelsier for Spook, it makes me think about Kandra, who are inherently of Ruin because they are born out of hemalurgical spikes directly. And they are very, very good at observation and imitation. because that's what they do. Like, that is straight up what they do. So I don't think it's far-fetched to believe that Ruin would be able to very convincingly emulate Kelsier in mannerisms, even as a specter.
You know what's funny to me? I'm so glad you brought Chandra into this, and this is something that I feel like I can address now that you've said it out loud, which is important, and that's often how I make decisions about whether or not I can say something textually. Orsur Tensoon, in the last book, made very clear that they believe that they are of preservation.
Oh, that's a good point. I had completely forgotten about that. But yeah, they do make that clear.
Yeah, because that's when they first bring up preservation. You are of preservation. You are of ruin. I am of preservation. And we are factually finding that to be the opposite as we've been working through the book with our hero here.
Yeah. Huh.
You can chew on that nugget, but I really appreciate that complexity that you brought to this, thinking about the idea of him potentially being possessed by Kelsier and like how that, lines up. Could it be Kelsier? Could it be Ruin? Is there another angle here? And it does make for an interesting argument that it isn't just, our boy, Ruin.
Mm-hmm. Our boy.
Spook brings up something really interesting here. He posits that the noblemen are immune to the mists. What do you make of this? And this is 115% a prediction.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the fact that noblemen are all of a lineage that have the potential to be allomancers. Based on like our current understanding, how it's been laid out for us so far, everything's getting shook up. Who knows? But that seems to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's probably related to that. Whatever is giving, well, it's the lineage we know from eating the nuggies. Their shared ancestors eating nuggies gave them the possibility of being allomancers, and I think that is also giving them immunity from whatever is happening in the mists.
Okay, great. That's a prediction. Sweet.
Okay, cool.
That's it. That's what I needed. That's what I wanted. I think you were very clear cut. So the idea here is that they are immune because they're allomantically
attuned.
Attuned. Yeah, that's a good word for it. Cool. I dig that. Sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on. Beldra I keep saying this differently each time. Beldra? I think it's Beldra, right? Did I say it differently before?
Beldra.
Beldra. Beldre. I think I said Beldre. I don't know. So Belle shows up, and when she does, it's very curious, all things considered. She's got an odd air about her, begging to have the life of her brother spared. Alrianne says she doesn't like her. There's kind of a lot of different things that go on in this moment, but what'd you make of her showing up here and getting away from her brother to kind of have this talk?
I can't get a read on her. I really can't pin anything on her at this point. I'm not sure. There's something weird about it. I think this is also the point where Alrianne points out that they're clearly nobles. Like, not just of noble lineage, but just straight up nobles based on how soft her hands are.
You're right.
So, I don't know. I really don't have a good read on Belle yet.
I'm glad that you were laughing while I was trying to get through the question when I just simplified it to Belle, because often that's what I'll do instead of trying to repronounce something is like, let's go with a nickname. Just like Kelsier. So all I'm saying is the Ks are in for nicknames.
Yep.
As I just nicknamed myself. Anyway, I don't know what's going on. Sometimes it's just chaos. I'm shocked you didn't comment on Alrianne's comment. She's like, I don't like her, and then Breeze goes, well, you don't like competition, sweetie.
Oh, I forgot. Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
Yarp. What's Breeze gonna do?
You're suggesting that
He's
Breeze...
suggesting.
Fair point. I mean, oh God, I just have to stop giggling to maybe get through this idea. That is... Yeah, no, I can't even try to parse it. But we're just gonna leave. We've been leaving a lot of grenades on the ground today. We're gonna leave that one right where it was. Cool. All right. With that, let's get into chapter 50 here. we've got our logbook, of course. One can see Ruin's craftiness in the meticulousness of his planning. He managed to orchestrate the downfall of the Lord Ruler only a short time before Preservation's power returned to the Well of Ascension. And then, within a few years of that event, he had freed himself. On the timescale of gods and their power, this very tricky timing was as precise as an expert cut performed by the most talented of surgeons.
Yeah, so this is kind of part of what we had referenced a few times throughout the episode already, but lots to juggle. But also, he's had 1,000 years to plan this precise moment. So it was a very surgical strike, as it's mentioned, but at the same time, there was a millennia of planning that went into it. So it's kind of both. It just needs to have that perfect storm of characters that he can manipulate.
Yeah, it could be a more perfect storm. Yeah, and I think that the idea here is that he had 1,000 years and he planned, and that is very precise because a god lives forever in theory, question mark. And so that leaves an interesting kind of statement there. What?
Another revelation.
What?
Another thing I just remembered. Vin took out her earring before getting into the well. Just happened to take it off, but it wasn't a compulsion, right?
I gotta go check the book. You can continue with your theory.
Well, I mean, the theory is that it's a hemalurgic spike and couldn't be... Sorry, this is like off the wall. I just thought about it randomly. So it's not related to anything we're just currently talking about. But there was the reason why the Inquisitors couldn't come save Ruin was because they'd have to take out their spikes. But she can obviously take out her spike, if that's the case.
That's true, because it's not life or death for her, right?
Right, because she won't drop dead once she removes it. But I remember commenting on, like, why did she take off her earring? And why did he make such an obvious point to say so, but not, like, give a reason why?
That seems interesting, doesn't it? Mm-hmm.
Does it say anything about a compulsion? It just says she takes it off, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no compulsion.
Or no explicit stated compulsion.
She's not being told by someone. Is that what you're intending by a compulsion?
I mean, not verbally, but there could be...
Like, Reen's not whispering, is what I mean here. Like,
that's, yeah, right. Yeah. But there could be, like, there's something inherently instinctive about her taking it off, if that's the case.
Right.
Which I would attribute to a compulsion of some sort.
It feels disingenuous to say that there isn't something compelling her.
But it's not stated.
No. It is.
Damn it.
Okay, well, the words are in the previous section, so this is fine. With a sudden flare, her earlobe began to hurt. She cried out, pulling her earring free, dropping it into the depths.
I don't remember that. Like, I get that it's there, but I don't remember that being
That's so unfortunate that I just gave you that information then.
No. I mean, right. Like, I remember having a conversation about it with you, talking about, like, me not realizing why she took it off, because it felt to me that it was just she decided to take it off and they commented on it and that was that, as opposed to it hurting her. But I could be just entirely misremembering that conversation from the jump, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, she's wondering why it's hurting, right? And so she takes it off while she's in the well, technically. She stepped into it.
Right. Cool. I mean, it's not that you gave me the exact
No,
words,
I didn't reveal anything. Yeah.
You didn't reveal anything to me.
It did feel very disingenuous to sit here and say it's not compelling because she is compelled by pain to remove it. She's not compelled by someone, though, which is what I was trying to pick at. Gotcha. She's not told to do it.
And yeah, because it hurts her. Mm-hmm. The way I remembered it in my mind was that she took it off and like set it, like setting an earring next to the pool. Like taking off jewelry and setting it like next to the hot tub before stepping in.
Well, because she does take off her sash. She does take off her sash and other stuff, but she does not take out the earring until she actually steps in.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. So with that, we go into the rest of chapter 50 here. Vin in the basement with Teldin, Ellen's friend, is just such a great moment. I love that it's Teldin, of course. But this is really her first time meeting one of his friends. It's a bad first meeting, don't you think?
Yeah. Not a great situation to meet her friend in, or his friend in. But there is the comment about how Elend was the only one that cared about the ska, and they all disagreed or just didn't give it the same sort of weight as Elend did.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I feel like, goes against what we've known about them, especially the conversations with Josties, and how like they seemed to actually share that philosophical ideal. And maybe it was just this guy, just Teldin, that disagreed and attributed that to everyone else as well. Or maybe Elend was just reading the room entirely wrong the whole time. But from what we had, from the interactions we've had in the past, this feels like a departure from our understanding.
Teldin specifically back in the first book is a little bit apprehensive about what Ellen's saying, and is one of the friends that pushes back in the scene where we're in his perspective for a moment. Or I think maybe is it in his perspective or is it in Vin's and she's listening at the window? Either way, one of those two. Regardless, he kind of pushes back a little bit more. I think there's an argument to be made, though, that Josties took everything that Elend said more seriously once the Lord Ruler was dead, and that's why he went the way that he did, and kind of like took the action seriously of like freeing and doing these specific things, and then it ended up in rebellion and being betrayed. So yeah, I think there's an argument there that it might have been Teldin and maybe a couple, and maybe Josties was listening more intently. This gets into that whole like applied philosophy versus just having a discussion thing. Like having a discussion does not equal, your belief or your faith on something. It's just, it is a position that you've decided to debate or take in a moment to discuss something. So maybe they weren't taking it all to heart entirely. And it was, like you said, Elend reading the room wrong.
Okay.
But they obviously didn't rat him out. So, yeah. Right. Yeah, talk and drink. They're still having a good time. And I'm sure this wasn't the only thing on their mind. They were talking about ways that they would change the government and other things, not just the ska, but it was Ellen's fascination that led him to where he is. Mm-hmm. So I also really love the verbal jousting here and the sort of really deep intelligence and honesty of Teldin in this section, being like just upfront with literally everything and as clear a communicator and negotiator as possible. It reminds me in some ways of like police negotiations where you have the good cop in the room. It's not that this is a good cop conversation or anything like that. I don't want to make that allegory, but at the very least, it feels very upfront, honest. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what you have on the table. Here are your choices. And I love it. It's a very different character.
Yeah, it's straight up. But at the same time, he doesn't need any deception. He doesn't need to be... No, she is truly.
She is without choices, without options, really, in this moment. Yeah. And I really appreciate that Vin does have this idea of how to handle and tackle the wines, right? To drink and push a duralumin pewter burn to hopefully overcome the effect. At the same time, her body casually burns pewter. Wouldn't it be better to casually burn it over a long period if she was passed out and like maybe recover faster? It's a wash. She was trying to beat it up front. So
it makes me think that this is almost a chemical reaction in the way that the amount of pewter versus the amount of poison is directly related, and they will neutralize each other, and whichever one has more is going to win out. So it doesn't matter whether or not she burns it quickly or slowly. But if she burns it quickly, she stays conscious, as opposed to like falling unconscious and letting it slowly dissipate.
Yeah. And I guess there's a question of like, could it be mixed to some degree with a metal like aluminum, or like it could be aluminum, like, you know what I mean? To burn off all the metals or burn off a specific metal. Like you said, I think that's a great point. It is like it is like stoichiometry in the way that it would be like an equation that you could really figure out as to how these chemicals balance.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is poison something other the poison that we know? Like, is that somehow slightly allomantic as well? Probably not. That gets too complicated, and I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. I'm not... Yeah. I get it. Cool. All right. With that, we end the week. Do you have anything else in this chapter? I think that this is a relatively short, simple chapter. We get introduced to well, not introduced, but Vin is introduced to Teldin, and, we kind of... It goes pretty quick. I mean, it's really just how do you get out of the situation? You can't. All of your, you are in checkmate, and we are giving you an option that will, at the very least, ensure you survive. Would you like to live?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what this is.
Mm-hmm.
And she runs through all the scenarios of like, well, I could kill everybody here. Like, but she knows.
What does that get you?
She knows that doesn't actually get her anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It is fun. It's a reveal, I think, about sort of the inner workings of Vin to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
That she recognizes that if she thought it would help her, she would have killed everybody in the room, despite what Teldon presumes.
Yeah, totally. It does bring up, like, she's like, you wouldn't kill, and it's like, I will kill if necessary, in her own head, which I think is a great thing to rely on too, because while she has explicitly said a couple times that she isn't Kelsier, this is a reminder that she does acknowledge that sometimes there's credence in that path. We have Gorodel still alive at this point, and definitely a big, at this point, I just painted this man with a tragedy. But the reason that he lived is because she didn't behave like Kelsier. The world's ending. Everyone's going to die, right? But yeah. So with that, anything else you want to add?
I don't think so.
Any other thoughts? Okay. So, ending this week, once Ruin was free from his prison, he was able to influence people more strongly, but impaling someone with a hemalurgic spike was difficult, no matter what the circumstances. To achieve such things, he apparently began with people who already had a tenuous grip on reality. Their insanity made them more open to his touch, and he could use them to spike more stable people. Either way, it is impressive how many important people Ruin managed to influence. King Penrod, ruling Luthadel at the time, is a very good example of this.
Is this insinuating that Penrod has a tenuous grasp on reality? Is that the insinuation, or is it insinuating that Ruin is able to control important people like Penrod? Or is it both? Like it's not super clear to me what the operator is on this last sentence.
Could you suggest that maybe the strife of the time could be causing a tenuous grip on reality? Could that work as a rationale?
I could rationalize it that way.
I feel like that's kind of the split that he's going for here, but I think that, or rather they are going for here, the writer, Brandon, I think that's what he wants in this text, but I think that that's more to point back at Zane and Vin than to point to Penrod necessarily. That said, I think that's saying that he's stressed and,
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, if you see visions and you know that you shouldn't be seeing visions, you're kind of like, the fuck is this, right? You've got that very intense, like, no way kind of energy.
I think another thing to point out on the insanity front
mm-hmm.
is Kelsier constantly called himself insane.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's more things to think about.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, with that, usually we would end, but we actually have predictions that we're going to read, that I want to read at the very least to go through them. So we're going to move into PJ's predictions here, or PJ's previous predictions, as I have it titled now. But we will be paying them off in mass once we are back to drinking in August, in our penultimate episode. So that'll be fun. Previous predictions here. So we cut to Zane for a second. He mentions the voice in his head. God had never tried to convince him to kill her, but God does speak to Zane in those last few moments and lets him know that he wasn't insane. What moment? And you said...
it just sucks that we don't get more of that here. I'm assuming we'll get more of this character somehow, maybe through that spike. But oof, such a great close.
Why'd you have to say through the spike? I was so irritated in this moment. I remember it distinctly. And I was like, you bastard, because you're right. And we do get more. All right. Sweet. Well, that's really the only one to pay off then. I swear to God there were two, but I'm drinking for the one when we drink again. So I have been schooled. All right. Cool. With that, next week, we are going to be reading chapters 51 through 58. 51 through 58. And that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, of course, to our producers, Tim and Andrew, for helping us keep the show going. Thank you to everybody that stopped in and listened to us for this little bit of a live show. Very last minute, we started recording. We're like, you want to just jump into the other channel and do it live? Anybody who wants to can. We've done this a couple times now. If you join us at patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey, you would have the opportunity to do the same. But if you check out our show notes, you'll find all the links to our schedule, Patreon, previous episodes, websites, social media accounts, all in one very convenient location.
Yeah, and absolutely, you can find us on all of the various social medias, like PJ was saying, Words Whiskey Pod on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, Words and Whiskey Show at gmail.com, patreon.com/Words and Whiskey, t-shirts on TeePublic. Follow the link. Beyond that, make sure that you leave all the podcasts that you love so much a review. It's actually a really big deal. It feeds into the algorithm. PJ and I were just chatting right before about this, and we've seen a substantial increase in the amount of Apple listeners recently, and that's in part because of reviews. It all impacts that ratio in which we get related to other shows and whatnot and recommended. So anything and everything that you can do for all the podcasts that you love in sport, leave them a review. Thank you so much for your support, everybody.